For any identity management system, be it SailPoint or Savient or OIM or any other identity management system, we require set of softwares and hardwares install the in order to install this application. So first, let's discuss about what are all the different hardware requirements for installing SailPoint, and then we'll go through various software requirement. Now, when we talk about hardware requirement, SailPoint has basically come across the set of footprints. So what is a footprint? Footprint is basically a hardware requirement for installing a particular scale of identities. For example, let's say your organization is currently having, let's say, 50,000 or 50K employees, and you wanted to manage all the employees via SailPoint. Okay, so depending upon the number of people or the identity which you are planning to manage via SailPoint, depending upon that, they have defined 5 different footprints. Okay, these 5 different footprints have different architecture. They will talk about how many machines you will require. They will talk about what should be the configuration of those machines, configuration in the terms of your hardware, configuration in the terms of how much RAM you would require, configuration in terms of what should be the processing speed like CPU, and other details. Okay, so SailPoint has basically defined 5 different types of footprints depending upon the number of identities which your organization have. So the first footprint which they have defined is micro footprint. When we talk about a micro footprint basically is a very small non-production environment. It's a very small non-production environment. This setup is basically very good for the sandbox environment. What is a sandbox environment? Sandbox environment is basically the place where all the developers have their own individual SailPoint machines and they are doing the things on their own system. And whenever they complete all the installations, they complete all the development activities, they will move the changes from the sandbox environment to development environment. So the software lifecycle follows in this sequence. So first we have the sandbox environment for each and every developer. Once the development has been completed in the sandbox environment, the changes has been migrated or moved to development environment. From development, the changes has been moved to SIT or QA, and then the changes have been finally moved to your production environment. So this particular micro setup is very much good for the sandbox environment where each and every individual are doing their own development stuffs in their own application. Now, what is the hardware requirement for micro footprintage? So first thing, micro footprint only supports the number of identities up to 5K. That is the number of users which you can manage via the micro footprint is up to 5K, not more than that. If you have number of users more than 5K, you have to go for a different footprint. Up to 5K, you can basically set up micro footprint. Now, what is the hardware requirement or what is the base configuration for your machine is required? The first thing is that we would require to set up the micro footprint, we require one simple machine. One single machine is required. That is also the machine also referred as one host. Be it the host may be a virtual machine, or your host may be a physical machine. Now, what is a virtual machine? Virtual machine is basically the machine which you are setting up with a virtualization software like VMware or VirtualBox. Now, what should be the hardware requirement for this particular host? So as per the sale point, the hardware requirement for this one is that if I talk about the processing speed, talking about CPU, you would require one or two core CPU. Then we would require 2 GB or 4 GB of RAM. Then we would require 40 GB of space, disk space, where you are basically installing and keeping the things in place so that SailPoint can utilize this space. Then the 64-bit OS is required. 64-bit operating system is required. Now here in the same host, when we talk about any identity management software, the identity management software also requires the database to be installed. So a database software is also required. Okay. So for the micro footprint in the same host, in the same machine, we are going to install the database and we are going to install the SailPoint application. And this is the machine requirement for the micro footprint. Now the next footprint which SailPoint has defined is small footprint. Now the small footprint basically help you to keep the number of identities up to 10K. So you can store 10K number of identities in the small footprint. Then how many systems are required? How many host machines are required? So for this one, we would require 2 host machines. Now the machine may be virtual or physical. Okay, so we require 2 different machines. So let's say this is host 1 and this is host 2. So why 2 machines are required? Basically, what SailPoint is suggesting us that in the host 1 machine, you install the application, the SailPoint application, and install the database software in the different machine. Okay, install the database software in the different machine. So we require 2 different hosts, host 1 and host 2. In these 2 hosts, what they are saying, install the application server in one host and install the database in the second host. Now, if you require to set up another instance, let's say you want to set up 2 different instances of SailPoint, you can do that as well. So in the host 2 machine, you can have application server 2 or the instance of the SailPoint instance 2 is running over here. Okay, so one host with a combined DB and one host with a simple application server. So how the architecture will look like? So basically the architecture of this thing is going to look like this. Let's say this is my firewall. This is end user who is trying to access the SailPoint application. Now here we have a load balancer in place. We have load balancer in place. Now the users are going to hit to this particular load balancer. Now this load balancer is basically connected with 2 different hosts. Host 1, that is the SailPoint instance 1, and host 2, that is the SailPoint instance 2. Now in the host 2, let's say we have SailPoint instance 2 along with we have the DB setup over here. We have the database software installed in host 2. In the host 1, we will only have the SailPoint instance 1 is running, though both the instances are hitting the same database. Okay, both the instances are hitting the same database. So all the data is stored in the same DB. Okay, so this is how the architecture of small footprint is going to look like. Now, what is the requirement over here? What is the requirement over here? So here we would require for the host machine, we would require 4-core processor. We would require 4-core processor. Along with that, we would require 8 GB of RAM. We require 640 64 bit operating system again. Along with these three requirements, we require for the database storage for the host 2 machine. Okay, for the host 2 machine, we would require basically 250 GB of RAID protected storage. Why RAID protected storage? Because you are storing the database, you are keeping the database over here in place. So this is the requirement for host 2. Yeah.
I mean, in the first, like, navigation, when user comes to load balancing and it goes to host 1, but database is not there. So how that it work? How the
So
connection?
basically, when we set up this instance of host 1, we are going to tell the host 1 configuration that your database is sitting in this particular location. Okay.
Okay, yeah, okay. And if it comes to host 2, then the host 2 will have the logic
Both
to, yeah.
both the SailPoint machines, when you when you set up the SailPoint instance, we will have a IIQ.properties file. Okay,
Okay,
this properties file basically keeps track of all the database information, that where, or it's not always required that your database is sitting over here. Maybe database can be sitting in remotely in some other place. So
right.
this
Yeah,
IIQ.properties file will contain the location of database and what's the username and password for connecting the database. So all the informations are basically kept in this particular file, and each and every individual SailPoint instance will have their own IIQ.properties file from where it is going to reference the things. Okay.
got it. Thanks.
Okay. Now this was the requirement for your small footprint. Now coming to the next footprint, that is your medium. When we talk about a medium footprint, the number of users or identities which you can kept over here is between 10K and 50K. So anything between 10K and 50K, you have to go with a medium footprint architecture. Now for medium footprint, we require basically various machines. For medium footprint, we require in total of 4 different host machines. So we have host 1, we have host 2, we have host 3, and we'll have one more host, let's say host 4. In host 4, we kept the database. This is host 1, host 2, host 3. Now, how the architecture of this is going to look like? The out of this 4 hosts, one host is only going to keep all the database details. Okay, so host 4 is only for the database software, no other things. Okay, now host 1, host 2, host 3 will have SailPoint instance running up. Let's say I'm saying instance 1, instance 2, and instance 3. Now instance 1 and instance 2 is going to act as a task host. What is task host? We'll discuss this. Instance 1 and instance 2 is going to act as a task host. Instance 3 is going to act as a UI host. Instance 3 is going to act as a UI host. Now what's the difference between task host and UI host? So the instance where the end users are directly interacting, those instances are referred as UI host, where the end users are directly interacting. From the UI host, basically the end user can submit a request, can approve the work items, can take decision on the certification, can take decision on the policies. So these kind of things, whenever the end users interactions are required, basically we are trying to restrict the user to only having access to this host 3. We are trying to restrict the user to only having access to host 3. The users will not be able to open host 2 and host 1 because they are not aware about the address where these systems are running. Okay, so host 3 is only for the user interaction. Now host 1 and host 2, whenever a request got submitted over here, these two servers will basically perform, basically in these two servers will perform the processing operations, will do the internal processing. We will do the internal processings of the requirements. Okay, for example, let's say a request has been submitted. Now the moment a request has been submitted, it go for the request engine to calculate to whom the approvals needs to be triggered, then it trigger the approval. Once the approval has been done, it is required to consume some resources to provision the user to target system. So all the processing things are going to happen in these two servers. Let's say on daily basis you have to run certain schedule job or task which are basically there to perform the synchronization of data from the HRMS to SailPoint. So those kind of backend things are going to be running on these task servers. Okay, so these task servers are basically dedicated for running the backend stuffs. Okay, the installation and everything is same. We are only segregating UI with task servers, with a difference that end users are always hitting this host 3. Okay, how we are going to restrict the user that they will always hit the host 3? In the load balancer, we are not mapping host 1 and host 2. Load balancer is only mapped with host 3. So whenever the end user request will come over here, it will always hit to this host 3 because no other route has been defined for host 1 and host 2. Host full is only for the database. So all these three machines are going to communicate to database. Okay, so host full will have only the database software. Now what is the requirement over here? What should be the hardware requirement over here? So for the task host, that is host 1 and host 2, we would require 4-core processor. We'd require 8 GB of RAM. We'd require again 50 GB of block storage, and it must be deployed in a 64-bit OS. So this is the requirement for host 1 and host 2, which are utilized as task host. Now talking about the UI host is also having the similar configuration. Okay, UI host will also contain the similar configuration. The moment I talk about your database over here, the database have a different requirement over here. The database would require 4-core processor. It must have at least 64 GB of RAM. It must have at least 64 GB of RAM. Along with that, we would require 500 GB of RAID protected storage for keeping the database. So this is the requirement for our medium footprint. Now going to the next footprint, that is large. The next type of footprint is large footprint.
Amit, all these three hosts are having the SailPoint, right, installed. One is for
Exactly.
user interaction and two is for processing, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. The next is large footprint. When we talk about large footprint, basically it supports the installation of identities up to 50K to 500K. That is from 50,000 to 5 lakhs users. So if the organization is having that much amount of user base, they must go for the large footprint. Now, how many systems are required for the large footprint? So for the large footprint, we would require 5 different dedicated hosts. So let's say this is host 1, host 2, host 3, host 4, and at last we have host 5. Host 5 is going to act as a DB server. Out of these 4 hosts, 2 hosts are going to act as a UI host, which are for the user interaction, and the 2 hosts are basically marked for running the backend job, that is task server. We have load balancer in the front end. So load balancer will only have the routing to UI host only, and all these hosts are in the back end interacting to the same DB. Okay, so we would require 5 different set of dedicated hosts for setting up large footprint. Now, how much RAM requirement or how much CPU requirement is there? So for the 2 batch hosts, we require, for the 2 task server, we require 4 core processor. Along with that, we require 16 GB of RAM, and we require same 64-bit operating system. Now for these 2 UI hosts, we would require 4 core processor, we would require 8 GB of RAM and 64-bit OS. So this is the requirement for the UI host. This is the requirement for the task host. Now the moment I talk about the database part, for the database, we would require 8 core processor. We would require 128 GB of RAM this time. It must be deployed in your 64-bit operating system, and we would require 1 TB of RAID protected storage. 1 TB of RAID protected storage. So this is the requirement for our large footprint. Now anything beyond 500K, they have basically defined the footprint as call. Okay, that if your organization is very large with having very huge user base, then what SailPoint is suggesting, kindly call them. They will basically suggest what should be the hardware and software requirements are there. Okay, so the last footprint is call. The moment you have more than 500K plus identity, you need to basically consult SailPoint. They will basically tell you that how many host, what should be the configuration of host, all those things are required. So this is the hardware requirement.